Well, hello there, and welcome to A People's Historian. I'm Jason Kishinev. We are reading about World War II, and we'll pick up where we left off. Let's just get into it. It was a war waged by a government whose chief beneficiary, despite volumes of reforms, was a wealthy elite. The alliance between big business and the government went back to the very first proposals of Alexander Hamilton to Congress after the Revolutionary War. By World War II, that partnership had developed and intensified. During the Depression, Roosevelt had once denounced the economic royalists, but he had always had the support of certain important business leaders. During the war, as Bruce Catton saw it from his post in the War Production Board, the economic royalists, denounced and derided, had a part to play now. Catton described the process of industrial mobilization to carry on the war and how in this process wealth became more and more concentrated in fewer and fewer large corporations. Kind of smacks of what it's like today, huh? In 1940, the United States had begun sending large amounts of war supplies to England and France. By 1941, 3/4 of the value of military contracts were handled by 56 large corporations. A Senate report, Economic Concentration in World War II, noted that the government contracted for scientific research in industry during the war, and although 2,000 corporations were involved, of $1 billion spent, $400 million went to 10 large corporations. Management remained firmly in charge of decision-making during the war, and although 12 million workers were organized in the CIO and AFL, labor was in a subordinate position. Labor management committees were set up in 5,000 factories as a gesture toward industrial democracy, but they acted mostly as disciplinary groups for absentee workers and devices for increasing production. Catton writes, "The big operators who made the working decisions had decided that nothing very substantial was going to be changed." Despite the overwhelming atmosphere of patriotism and total dedication to winning the war, despite the no-strike pledges of the AFL and CIO, many of the nation's workers, frustrated by the freezing of wages while business profits rocketed skyward, went on strike. During the war, there were 14,000 strikes, involving 6,770,000 workers, more than in any comparable period in American history. In 1944 alone, 1 million workers were on strike, in the mines and the steel mills, in the auto and transportation equipment industries. When the war ended, the strikes continued in record numbers. 3 million on strike in the first half of 1946. According to Jeremy Brecher, if not for the disciplinary hand of the unions, there might have been a general confrontation between the workers of a great many industries and the government supporting the employers. In Lowell, Massachusetts, for example, according to an unpublished manuscript by Mark Miller, there were as many strikes in 1943 and 1944 as in 1937. It might have been a people's war, but here was dissatisfaction at the fact that the textile mill profits grew 600% from 1940 to 1946, while wage increases in cotton goods industries went up 36%. How little the war changed the difficult condition of women's workers is shown by the fact that in Lowell, among women war workers with children, only 5% could have their children taken care of by nursery schools. The others had to make their own arrangements. beneath the noise of enthusiastic patriotism, there were many people who thought war was wrong, even in the circumstances of fascist aggression. Out of 10 million drafted for the armed forces during World War II, only 43,000 refused to fight. But this was 3 times the proportion of conscientious objectors in World War I. Of these 43,000, about 6,000 went to prison, which was proportionately 4 times the number of conscientious objectors who went to prison during World War I. Of every 6 men in federal prison, 1 was there as a conscientious objector. Many more than 43,000 refusers did not show up for the draft at all. The government lists about 350,000 cases of draft evasion, including technical violations as well as actual desertion, so it is hard to tell the true number, but it may be that the number of men who either did not show up or claimed conscientious objector status was in the hundreds of thousands. Not a small number. And this in the face of an American community almost unanimously for the war. Among these soldiers who were not conscientious objectors, who seemed willing fighters, it is hard to know how much resentment there was against authority, against having to fight in a war whose aims were unclear, inside a military machine whose lack of democracy was very clear. No one recorded the bitterness of enlisted men against the special privileges of officers in the army of a country known as a democracy. To give just one instance, combat crews in the Air Force in the European theater, going to the base movies between bombing missions, found 2 lines, an officer's line, short, and an enlisted men's line, very long. There were 2 mess halls. Even as they prepared to go into combat, the enlisted men's food was different, worse than the officers. The literature that followed World War II, James Jones's From Here to Eternity, Joseph Heller's Catch-22, and Norman Mailer's The Naked and the Dead, captured the GI anger against the army brass. In The Naked and the Dead, the soldiers talk in battle, and one of them says, "The only thing wrong with this army is it never lost a war." Toglio was shocked. "You think we ought to lose this one?" Red found himself carried away. "What have I against the goddamn Japs? You think I care if they keep this friggin' jungle? What's it to me if Cummins gets another star?" "General Cummins, he's a good man," Martinez said. "There ain't a good officer in the world," Red stated. There seemed to be widespread indifference, even hostility, on the part of the Negro community to the war, despite the attempts of Negro newspapers and Negro leaders to mobilize black sentiment. Lawrence Whitner quotes a black journalist, "The Negro is angry, resentful, and utterly apathetic about the war. Fight for what?" he is asking. "This war doesn't mean a thing to me. If we win, I lose. So what?" A black army officer, home on furlough, told friends in Harlem he had been in hundreds of bull sessions with Negro soldiers and found no interest in the war. A student at a Negro college told his teacher, "The Army Jim Crows us. The Navy lets us serve only as messmen. The Red Cross refuses our blood. Employers and labor unions shut us out. Lynchings continue. We are disenfranchised, Jim Crowed, spat upon." What more could Hitler do than that? NAACP leader Walter White repeated this to a black audience of several thousand people in the Midwest, thinking they would disapprove. But instead, as he recalled, "To my surprise and dismay, the audience burst into such applause that it took me some 30 or 40 seconds to quiet it." In January 1943, there appeared in a Negro newspaper this draftee's prayer. Dear Lord, today I go to war, to fight, to die. Tell me what for. Dear Lord, I'll fight. I do not fear. Germans or Japs, my fears are here. America. But there was no organized Negro opposition to the war. In fact, there was little organized opposition from any source. The Communist Party was enthusiastically in support. The Socialist Party was divided, unable to make a clear statement one way or the other. A few small anarchist and pacifist groups refused to back the war. The Women's International League for Peace and Freedom said, "War between nations or classes or races cannot permanently settle conflicts or heal the wounds that brought them into being." The Catholic Worker wrote, "We are still pacifists." The difficulty of merely calling for peace in a world of capitalism, fascism, and communism, dynamic ideologies, aggressive actions, troubled some pacifists. They began to speak of revolutionary nonviolence. A.J. Must of the Fellowship of Reconciliation said in later years, "I was not impressed with the sentimental, easygoing pacifism of the early part of the century. People then felt that if they sat and talked pleasantly of peace and love, they would solve the problems of the world." The world was in the midst of a revolution, Must realized, and those against violence must take revolutionary action, but without violence. A movement of revolutionary pacifism would have to make effective contracts with oppressed and minority groups such as Negroes, sharecroppers, industrial workers. Only one organized socialist group opposed the war unequivocally. This was the Socialist Workers' Party. The Espionage Act of 1917, still on the books, applied to wartime statements, but in 1940, with the United States not yet at war, Congress passed the Smith Act. This took Espionage Act prohibitions against talk or writing that would lead to refusal of duty in the armed forces and applied them to peacetime. The Smith Act also made it a crime to advocate the overthrow of the government by force or violence, or to join any group that advocated this, or to publish anything with such ideas. In Minneapolis in 1943, 18 members of the Socialist Workers' Party were convicted for belonging to a party whose ideas, expressed in its Declaration of Principles and in the Communist Manifesto, were said to violate the Smith Act. They were sentenced to prison terms, and the Supreme Court refused to review their case. A few voices continued to insist that the real war was inside each nation. Dwight MacDonald's wartime magazine Politics presented in early 1945 an article by the French worker philosopher Simone Weil. Whether the mask is labeled fascism, democracy, or dictatorship of the proletariat, our great adversary remains the apparatus, the bureaucracy, the police, the military, not the one facing us across the frontier or the battle lines, which is not so much our enemy as our brother's enemy, but the one that calls itself our protector and makes us its slaves. No matter what the circumstances, the worst betrayal will always be to subordinate ourselves to this apparatus and to trample underfoot in its service all human values in ourselves and in others. Still, the vast bulk of the American population was mobilized in the army and in civilian life to fight the war, and the atmosphere of war enveloped more and more Americans. Public opinion polls show large majorities of soldiers favoring the draft for the post-war period. Hatred against the enemy, against the Japanese particularly, became widespread. Racism was clearly at work. Time magazine, reporting the Battle of Iwo Jima, said, "The ordinary, unreasoning Jap is ignorant. Perhaps he is human. Nothing indicates it. So there was a mass base of support for what became the heaviest bombardment of civilians ever undertaken in any war: the aerial attacks on German and Japanese cities. One might argue that this popular support made it a people's war. But if people's war means a war of people against attack, a defensive war, if it means a war fought for humane reasons instead of for the privileges of an elite, a war against the few, not the many, then the tactics of all-out aerial assault against the populations of Germany and Japan destroy that notion. Italy had bombed cities in the Ethiopian War. Italy and Germany had bombed civilians in the Spanish Civil War. At the start of World War II, German planes dropped bombs on Rotterdam in Holland, Coventry in England, and elsewhere. Roosevelt had described these as inhuman barbarism that was profoundly shocked the conscience of humanity. These German bombings were very small compared with the British and American bombings of German cities. In January 1943, the Allies met at Casablanca and agreed on large-scale air attacks to achieve the destruction and dislocation of the German military, industrial, and economic system, and the undermining of the morale of the German people to the point where their capacity for armed resistance is fatally weakened. And so the saturation bombing of German cities began, with 1,000-plane raids on Cologne, Essen, Frankfurt, Hamburg. The English flew at night with no pretense of aiming at military targets. The Americans flew in the daytime and pretended precision, but bombing from high altitudes made that impossible. I'll take just a quick moment and note that Howard Zinn actually was a bombardier in World War II. So he knows this stuff firsthand and questioned himself later after the war. The climax of this terror bombing was the bombing of Dresden in early 1945, in which the tremendous heat generated by the bombs created a vacuum into which fire leaped swiftly in a great firestorm through the city. More than 100,000 died in Dresden. Winston Churchill, in his wartime memoirs, confined himself to this account of the incident. "We made a heavy raid in the latter month on Dresden, then a center of communication of Germany's eastern front. The bombing of Japanese cities continued the strategy of saturation bombing to destroy civilian morale. One nighttime firebombing of Tokyo took 80,000 lives, and then on August 6, 1945, came the lone American plane in the sky over Hiroshima, dropping the first atomic bomb, leaving perhaps 100,000 Japanese dead and tens of thousands more slowly dying from radiation poisoning. 12 U.S. Navy flyers in the Hiroshima city jail were killed in the bombing, a fact that the U.S. government has never actually officially acknowledged, according to historian Martin Sherwin. 3 days later, a second atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki, with perhaps 50,000 killed. The justification for these atrocities was that this would end the war quickly, making unnecessary an invasion of Japan. Such an invasion would cost a huge number of lives, the government said. 1 million, according to Secretary of State Burns. 500,000, Truman claimed, was the figure given him by General George Marshall. When the papers of the Manhattan Project, the project to build the atomic bomb, were released years later, they showed that Marshall urged a warning to the Japanese about the bomb, so people could be removed and only military targets hit. These estimates of invasion losses were not realistic and seem to have been pulled out of the air to justify bombings, which, as their effects became known, horrified more and more people. Japan, by August 1945, was in desperate shape and ready to surrender. New York Times military analyst Hanson Baldwin wrote shortly after the war, "The enemy, in a military sense, was in a hopeless strategic position by the time the Potsdam demand for unconditional surrender was made on July 26th. Such, then, was the situation when we wiped out Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Need we have done it? No one can, of course, be positive, but the answer is almost certainly negative. The United States Strategic Bombing Survey, set up by the War Department in 1944 to study the results of aerial attacks in the war, interviewed hundreds of Japanese civilian and military leaders after Japan surrendered, and reported just after the war, based on a detailed investigation of all the facts and supported by the testimony of the surviving Japanese leaders involved. It is the survey's opinion that certainly prior to the 31st of December 1945, and in all probability prior to the 1st of November 1945, Japan would have surrendered even if the atomic bombs had not been dropped, even if Russia had not entered the war, and even if no invasion had been planned or contemplated. But could American leaders have known this in August 1945? The answer is clearly yes. The Japanese code had been broken and Japan's messages were being intercepted. It was known the Japanese had instructed their ambassador in Moscow to work on peace negotiations with the Allies. Japanese leaders had begun talking of surrender a year before this, and the emperor himself had begun to suggest in June 1945 that alternatives to fighting to the end be considered. On July 13th, Foreign Minister Shigenori Togo wired his ambassador in Moscow, "Unconditional surrender is the only obstacle to peace." Martin Sherwin, after an exhaustive study of the relevant historical documents, concludes, "Having broken the Japanese code before the war, American intelligence was able to, and did, relay this message to the President, but it had no effect whatever on efforts to bring the war to a conclusion." If only the Americans had not insisted on unconditional surrender. That is, if they were willing to accept one condition to the surrender, that the emperor, a holy figure to the Japanese, remain in place, the Japanese would have agreed to stop the war. Why did the United States not take that small step to save both American and Japanese lives? Was it because too much money and effort had been invested in the atomic bomb not to drop it? General Leslie Groves, head of the Manhattan Project, described Truman as a man on a toboggan, the momentum too great to stop it. Or was it, as British scientist PMS Blackett suggested, that the United States was anxious to drop the bomb before the Russians entered the war against Japan? The Russians had secretly agreed they were officially not at war with Japan. They would come into the war 90 days after the end of the European War. That turned out to be May 8th. And so, on August 8th, the Russians were due to declare war on Japan. But by then, the big bomb had been dropped, and the next day, a second one would be dropped on Nagasaki. The Japanese would surrender to the United States, not the Russians. And the United States would be the occupier of post-war Japan. In other words, Blackett says, the dropping of the bomb was the first major operation of the Cold Diplomatic War with Russia. Blackett is supported by American historian Gar Alperovitz, who notes a diary entry for July 28, 1945 by Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal, describing Secretary of State James F. Burns as most anxious to get the Japanese affair over with before the Russians got in. Truman had said, "The world will note that the first atomic bomb was dropped on Hiroshima, a military base. That was because we wished in this first attack to avoid, insofar as possible, the killing of civilians." It was a preposterous statement. Those 100,000 killed in Hiroshima were almost all civilians. The U.S. Strategic Bombing Survey said in its official report, Hiroshima and Nagasaki were chosen as targets because of their concentration of activities and population. The dropping of the second bomb on Nagasaki seems to have been scheduled in advance, and no one has ever been able to explain why it was dropped. Was it because this was a plutonium bomb, whereas the Hiroshima bomb was a uranium bomb? Were the dead and irradiated of Nagasaki victims of a scientific experiment? Martin Sherwin says that among the Nagasaki dead were probably American prisoners of war. He notes a message of July 31st from headquarters, U.S. Army Strategic Air Forces, Guam, to the War Department. Reports prisoner of war sources, not verified by photos, give location of Allied prisoner of war camp 1 mile north of center of city of Nagasaki. Does this influence the choice of this target for initial centerboard operation? Request immediate reply. The reply: targets previously assigned for centerboard remain unchanged. True, the war then ended quickly. Italy had been defeated a year earlier. Germany had recently surrendered, crushed primarily by the armies of the Soviet Union on the Eastern Front, aided by the Allied armies on the West. Now Japan surrendered. The fascist powers were destroyed. And let's end there. We'll pick it up in episode 3. Thank you for joining me. I hope you enjoyed the reading. If you did, I'd like you to hit the like and subscribe button and the notification button up there, because YouTube is known to unsubscribe people from these channels. So we'll see you next time. Have a good one.